Hello, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's session. Thanks for joining us. So great to have you here with us in the training. We'll just give everyone a moment or two to join us and find your audio settings. Whilst we're waiting to get started, feel free to say hello in the chat if you'd like to introduce yourselves and let us know a little bit about yourself or what organization you're joining from. And we'll get started in just a few seconds' time. Thanks, everyone. All right, hello to those who've just joined us. Welcome to today's training session. So we're just giving everyone a moment to join us. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, but I think we've got lots to cover in our session today. So in the interests of time, let's get started. So as I say, a big thank you and welcome to everyone for joining us at today's training session. And we're here today as the first part of a two-part workshop on gender equality in capital markets. So as I've said, we've got lots to cover, so we're going to dive into giving you a bit of an introduction to the session and what we're aiming to achieve in our training. So firstly, just to say a big thank you to the exchanges who've hosted us today for this session, particularly the Ethiopian Securities Exchange, and as well to Financial Sector Deepening Ethiopia as well for bringing us all together at the training. This training is a really collaborative effort, partnering with IFC, UN Women, Columbia University, and with support from the Luxembourg government. So a big thank you to all of our partners who help make these sessions possible. So to get us started with the session, we're going to have a few opening remarks. Whilst we're just waiting for hopefully our speaker from ESX to join us, I will flick ahead as we have a second speaker, we're lucky today, joining us as well. So I'm pleased to introduce Rose Lumumba, who's the Corporate Governance Specialist for IFC, and Rose will be giving us a short opening comment. So many thanks for joining us, Rose, and over to you.
Thank you, Fiona. Good morning, everyone, especially colleagues from the Ethiopian Securities Exchange and really the capital markets industry, FSD Africa, and our partners, the UN Women, the exchanges. So really, it's my pleasure to join you this morning, this very important training session where we will be focusing on the importance of gender and the benefits that women bring when they are part of the capital markets industry. The IFC is very pleased with the partnership and with the milestones that we have made across the globe with the partners in raising awareness of the importance of gender parity and gender equity and gender inclusion really in the capital markets industry. Now, great congratulations, of course, to the Ethiopian Securities Exchange for hosting us. Thank you very much. And also thank you for being keen in giving everybody an equitable chance to invest in the capital markets. You see, investors in the capital markets really come from both sides of gender. They are male, they are female, but overly in the globe, we have many more investors from the male gender. And really, it is the purpose of this training is to raise awareness on the importance of the other half of the universe and what they can bring, and really to encourage everybody to participate in the securities exchange because it's created for everyone. At IFC, we are very keen in raising this gender parity and supporting women in raising their awareness of what they could do in the capital markets, helping them to access funds so that they can, grow their businesses and make them contribute to the capital markets industry as well as to the countries where their businesses are hosted. And so it's a pleasure really to partner and to support the training today. I wish Fiona and London and the rest of the team who will be presenting today all the best. And to you who will be attending, obviously, I hope that will be very beneficial, that you will enjoy yourself, and importantly, that you will learn. And most importantly, that you will apply the information and the knowledge that you will receive from today. Thank you very much, everybody. I wish you all the best.
Thanks very much, Rose. And I think some great comments to start the session with, indeed, all about application. So hopefully that's what we can help to inspire today. So I'm also, as I've mentioned, very grateful to the Ethiopian Securities Exchange for hosting us today. And I'm very pleased to see that we also have Tilahun Kasahun, the CEO of ESX, joining us as well. So many thanks for joining us. And I'll just pass over to you as well for a welcome remark from your side. Thank you.
Thanks, Fiona, and thanks for jointly organizing this session with us. Our gratitude also goes to FSDE Ethiopia. As I would say, a fresh CEO and fresh exchange, it goes without saying. We're pleased to have your support and collaboration. We're obviously cognizant of the fact that as we develop the Ethiopian capital markets, we need to give due attention to broader social governance and environmental considerations. One of which is really the embedding gender into our work, so that we don't make the mistake of disregarding a significant portion of our population, significant potential in developing the capital market ecosystem. So we're with your support, we're happy that we are taking this from get-go. In general, I think it goes without saying, we will have to find a way that the capital markets ecosystem contributes to the inclusion angle. Most importantly, because women in particular in Ethiopia have really showed resilience in leading families, organizations, and businesses. And we would like to take as many entrepreneurs, business owners, and managers and leaders into the capital markets ecosystem. Really, that's the key angle for the exchange. But we're also, cognizant of the fact that, including women in board, strategy, management, provides the capital markets ecosystem its own, strength, and contributes in terms of, developing trust, accountability, and transparency. We're also cognizant of the fact that, where we're trying to develop a robust ecosystem with as many investor base as possible, we would like to see more women in saving capacities, in investment capacities. So we're glad that this kind of occasions and forums will contribute into all these many aspects. We're trying our level best in terms of developing capacity. I'm sure you heard about the ESX Academy that we've developed together with FSDE Ethiopia, and I think the recording of this session and potentially other educational materials we would like to bring more into the academy and the ecosystem. And I think it's all to say this would be one of the first activities, but probably not the last. And with that, I'll thank the organizers, the participants, and the team behind this initiative. And thank you for giving me the chance.
Great. Thank you so much, Tilahun. I think highlighted lots of very relevant things that we're going to be diving into in more detail today. So thanks very much for setting things in context. And indeed to you and the team at ESX and FSDE Ethiopia as well for hosting us. Fantastic. Thank you so much. So with that, I'll just give us a little bit of an overview now of the training session and the content that we're going to be covering. So as you probably know, today's training is all about looking at the interface between gender equality and global markets. So as you might already feel, gender equality and finance can be both sensitive as well as complex topics. So rather than pretending that complexity doesn't exist, What we're aiming to do in this training is to better understand it and to identify the ways to move forwards. So in today's session, particularly, we're going to be looking at understanding those complexities. And in our second part of the training on Wednesday, we're going to get into more action-oriented mechanisms for advancing gender equality and addressing these complexities. So as you've probably noticed, we have a few housekeeping points we'll just cover to get us started. So as you probably know, this is a 2-hour training session that we have today, and we have the next part of our training taking place on Wednesday. We've got the live opportunity for you to ask questions throughout the training session. So I'll explain more about that in a second, but make sure to get that opportunity to ask your questions and feel free to ask anything that you're thinking about in this topic area. We'll also really be happy to see your participation and engagement in the session as well. So we're going to be using a number of interactive tools, including the polls in Zoom and Menti as well, which I'll explain shortly. So really encourage you to take part in those exercises as well as we move through the training. And for that, finally, for taking part in the training, you're able to receive a completion certificate as well. And so to get that certificate, you're going to need to fill out a feedback survey, and we're going to share those details about that with you at the end of the training on Wednesday. And just on a practical level, as you've probably noticed by now, as participants, you're muted in the session, but we really do encourage you to make use of the chat and the Q&A to participate throughout. So great to see a number of you already sharing and saying hello in the chat as we move through. Please feel free to continue to do that. But if you have any particular questions in the team, please make sure to put those into the Q&A box in particular, and that will just allow us to keep track of those questions and respond to you directly as well. And so to say a little bit about who's going to be delivering the training. So I'm Fiona Quinlan-Wells from the UNSSE team. Just one slide. We're missing a slide, apologies. But I'm joined by my colleague, Landon Wilcock as well, who will be introducing himself shortly in the session as well. So it's myself and Landon from the UNSSE team. And then moving on to the slide I was just about to show, we're very pleased to be joined by our partners at UN Women. So today we're very happy to be joined by Miwa Park, who is the Women's Empowerment Principles Coordinator within the Global Secretariat for WEPS. Hi, Miwa. And then later on in our training session as well, we'll also have a guest speaker joining us from Bloomberg. So we have Eureka Murasawa joining us, who is a sustainable finance data specialist, who's going to be speaking to us about how Bloomberg are using company sustainability information on gender in particular in their indices and scoring. Okay, so diving into a little bit of an overview of the training topic, as I've already mentioned, we know that gender equality can be a very complex topic, and it's something that you do need to see that way. However, to help us guide through that complexity, we've broken this training down into 4 clear steps that both individuals and organisations can use as they're hoping to address this complexity and to consider how to enhance gender equality in their operations and processes. And so here you will see just an overview of those 4 steps that we're talking about here. So in our part 1 training today, we're going to be focusing on the first 2 steps, which is prepare and align. And in these first few steps, we're looking at focusing on understanding what gender equality is, why it's important, and providing an overview of the main standards and guidelines that can help to guide performance on this topic. And then in our part 2 session on Wednesday, we're going to be digging into action with the second 2 steps, which are implementation and communication. And so to help us to work through those 4 different areas of activity, we've set ourselves different learning objectives for the training. And so from today's training, we have 2 key learning objectives. So firstly, to understand why action is needed for enhanced gender equality. And secondly, to identify what tools we can use to improve gender equality. So keep in mind, those are the 2 key things we're hoping to focus on today. And then just to show you how our time today breaks down together. So we'll be spending an even amount of time on our 2 different units on prepare and align. We'll take a short break in the middle of the session as well, just to refresh ourselves. And then we'll wrap up at the end with some time for questions if we have time to cover those as well. But as I said, we'll cover questions, responses in the written Q&A box as we go along as well. So please do ask your questions as we go, and we'll do our best to answer you as we're moving through the training session. Okay, so to get us started with that interactive participation that I mentioned, we'd like to do our first Menti exercise together. So Landon's just going to share with you in the chat box now the link to access our Menti survey. So we're going to come back to this link a number of different times throughout the session. So recommend finding your way to Menti now and keeping that tab open in the background, and we'll use it on a couple of different occasions. I will also share my screen with you now, and that will show you another couple of ways that you can also access Menti as well. Okay. So as I said, the easiest thing to do is probably to click on that Menti link that Landon has shared in the chat. Two other options for you though would be to use that QR code that you can see in the bottom of my screen currently. And a final option, if you want to go to menti.com, you can also enter that 8-letter number code that you're seeing at the top of the screen as well. And so our first question, just to warm us up really, is to get a sense from everyone here as to what is your current level of comfort, experience, or understanding on the different topics that we're hoping to cover with you today. So firstly, how confident you are in your knowledge of gender equality and global markets. Secondly, how comfortable you would be discussing this topic with others. And finally, how likely you would be to take action to improve gender equality in your organization. I'll just remove the QR code, but if anyone needs the QR code again, let me know and I can show that. Okay, great. Thanks for those who voted already. So I can see at the moment, most people are maybe feeling middling to high confidence, actually, I would say, which is always nice to see. So maybe the least confident currently on the connection between gender equality and global markets, but feeling a little bit more confident overall on how to discuss this topic with others and taking action. So that's fantastic to see already many of you perhaps already thinking or taking action on this topic. So always great from this training for us to learn from each other as well. So do feel free to share in the comments as we're going any particular things that you personally or your organizations are doing as well on this topic. It's always great for everyone to hear about those different ideas that you have already. But fantastic. Thanks for sharing, everyone. So great to get an understanding of where everyone's comfort on these topics currently is at. Okay, so as I said, I would recommend keeping that Menti tab available, and we'll come back to that later in the session. But with that, I'll hand over to my colleague Landon, who's going to get us started on the first unit of the training.
Great, and good morning again, everyone. It's fantastic to be here with you today, and thanks again for joining. So, as my colleague Fiona said, we want to take a moment now to look at how gender connects to finance. We have three main sections in each unit, narrowing a bit more into the topic as we go along. So we'll start by looking at what the case for action is. Then we'll look at what markets are doing in terms of gender equality progress after looking at some market trends as well. And in the final section, we'll hone in on terminology that will help us communicate about gender equality. So many of you will already have an idea on this, but first we're looking at prepare on the case for gender and why does gender matter. To get started, it's important to highlight that equality between genders is indeed a human right. It's widely documented that women and girls experience adverse impacts of business activities differently and often disproportionately. They also face additional barriers in seeking access to effective remedies. Moreover, because of multiple forms of discrimination, different women and girls may be affected differently by business activities depending on their age, color, caste, class, ethnicity, perhaps where they're located, if that's a rural, remote, or urban setting, religion, language, literacy, access to economic resources, marital status, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, perhaps migration, indigenous or minority status. So it's a long list of different aspects that can influence how someone is treated. and their experience. But what that's all to say is humans are complex beings with many elements that make up unique identities. And as such, this topic is also a complex and interconnected one. Now, the document you see here on your screen is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, or UNGPs, which are the global authoritative standards to prevent, mitigate, and remediate business-related adverse human rights impacts. Here on this slide, we've flagged 4 of the principles to help us understand the obligations that businesses have. The first principle we flag is Principle 14, which indicates that the responsibility of business enterprises to respect human rights applies to all enterprises, regardless of their size, sector, operational context, ownership, and structure. So essentially, all business enterprises have responsibility. The second principle we highlight here is number 16, which encourages businesses to express their commitment to meet their human rights responsibility through a statement of policy that should have certain characteristics. You can read more about those characteristics in the document on your screen. And we'll also share in the chat, which I highly recommend taking a look at if you haven't already familiarized yourself with this publication. Another principle we wanted to flag is Principle 20. This highlights that to verify whether adverse human rights impacts are being addressed, businesses should track the effectiveness of their response by using sex disaggregated data. That's something we'll talk more about in today and the future session. But this data should be collected in line with a human rights-based approach and outcome indicators developed in consultation with affected people and gender experts. We'll be discussing this in more detail in part 2 in our communications module, but it's also important to recognize that even if the data is not made public, it's important to disaggregate the data so that you can make better decisions internally in your firm and identify any issues as they could arise. The last principle we'll mention today is Principle 21, which particularly highlights the important role of communication. So according to this principle, businesses should be prepared to communicate externally, particularly when concerns are raised by or on behalf of affected stakeholders. Businesses should be communicating adequately with easily accessible information to affected stakeholders regularly, and both the information and the means of communication should be responsive to gender discrimination and the differentiated impacts experienced by women and girls. What's important to consider from a financial perspective is that in addition to being the right thing to do as a human right and having a positive impact on society, organizations should be considering the repercussions associated with violating the human rights of employees, partners, and stakeholders. With that, there's also the policy or legal and reputational risks, which are important to be considered for gender equality and social related disclosures as well. So you've probably seen this image before of the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's important to note that sustainable development depends on equality of genders. Gender equality is one of its own. You see here towards the right side of the screen, number 5 on gender equality, and it's one of the 17 SDGs agreed to by UN member states, and it also contributes to all other SDGs. For those who may not be familiar, the SDGs represent an ambitious attempt to end poverty, protect the planet, and improve the lives and well-being of all of humanity. So as mentioned, SDG 5 focuses specifically on gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls, but there are aspects of gender equality appearing in the targets and associated indicators of 10 of the 17 SDGs. And if you want to see more about how gender equality links to these different SDGs, you can have a look at Annex 3 of the SSE Guidance on Gender Equality for Exchanges. Now, some folks naturally ask, what exactly does improving gender equality do for society? You know, we've covered it's an important human right and that it's as well important for businesses. but what are some of the impacts of increasing gender equity? So first, we see that studies have shown that when we have more equality of genders in society, we also see lower levels of violence, greater economic productivity, and increased resilience against financial and environmental crises. So we'll cover a bit more on the environmental crises because that's something that's being talked about more and more with climate change. I want to remind you that by gender equality, we don't want to imply more women than men, but equality means that both women and men are represented, have the same level of power, and both are heard and understood equally. However, to achieve equality in many cases, we do need to provide some extra support to the less represented gender, which in many cases today is woman. To give you an example of the extent of impact that gender equality currently has on society, a study by the World Bank estimates that the loss in human capital wealth due to gender equality is over 160 trillion, which is just a massive figure, obviously. And another study concluded that the equal participation of men and women entrepreneurs could boost global GDP by approximately 3 to 6%, which again is just a massive number. To read more about this, I recommend clicking on some of the links in the slide in your handout to see a bit more about the economic effects of gender inequality. Now, I want to take a moment to discuss a few more benefits of equality and promoting gender equality. We can confidently say has been found to have positive social, environmental, economic, and business benefits. And now we'll narrow a bit deeper into some of these benefits that companies can find from enhancing equality in their organizations. So we can see that companies with higher levels of diversity, both gender and ethnic, at the executive level are found to show higher performance than their less diverse counterparts on both profitability and long-term value creation measures. We also see different genders have different attitudes towards risk. So if our decision makers, like the board and leadership team, are gender diverse across the organization and programs, that can lead to more balanced decision making. As mentioned, different genders also experience the world differently and therefore have different views and ideas to contribute. We also see that companies with workplace policies that support and promote gender equality are better able to attract and retain talent, which is so important in an increasingly competitive human, sorry, I lost my train of thought, but increasingly important for managing and attracting and retaining talent. Gender lens investing, mandated investments also globally increased from 100 million to 2.4 billion between 2014 and 2018. So we're seeing more and more dollars and companies invest in gender lens investing. We also see that companies with more diverse boards and senior management teams demonstrate better environmental, social, and governance practices and performance, including having more ethical business practices, enhanced workplace and workforce policies, and stronger community relations. So those are just a few benefits of equality for the firm. Now let's look at one of the many case studies on this topic, and we'll see a bit more detail about the benefits that diverse companies are seeing. So this data comes from a study by FP Analytics, that's the Independent and Research Advisory Division of Foreign Policy. And this study looked particularly at industries that are traditionally male-dominated, analyzing over 2,300 publicly listed companies. They conducted more than 150 in-depth interviews and follow-up surveys. So this survey or this study found that companies with more women on their board have on average a higher profit, greater transparency, and higher social ratings. We'll take a moment to look at those three statistics. First, profitability. So the study found that the companies with the highest percentage of women in management were on average 47% more profitable than those with the lowest. These findings are consistent with other evidence that promoting gender diversity can benefit a business's bottom line. There's also a study by the ILO, or International Labor Organization, where women interviewed for the study detailed how they're leading their organizations on new revenue-generating paths, advancing innovation, and advocating for harm-reducing practices, as well as increasing transparency to build stakeholder trust. On increasing transparency, so building trust across stakeholder groups, including employees, consumers, regulators, and investors, we know is vital for legacy industries that are working to evolve their business models, improve regulatory compliance and performance, and respond to consumers' always changing needs. The study found that the companies with the highest percentage of women on boards are more transparent in terms of ESG information disclosure. And we also saw that in particular, companies with at least one woman on the board are 17% more transparent than those with 0 female board members. The last piece of the study I'll deep dive into is on CSR, corporate social responsibility. And this analysis found a positive correlation between gender diversity on corporate boards and companies' social responsibility performance. Women interviewed for the study provided many firsthand accounts of their efforts to protect safety and labor rights, integrate community development into business strategy, as well as building local capacity and empowering women. You can remember also that we discussed a few slides ago that diversity and equality can have important societal and environmental impacts. With that, another interesting aspect of this same study by FP was that equality not only had an impact within the company, but also for the environment and community where it operates. For example, more diverse boards were 39% more likely to reduce emissions. They're also 46% more water efficient and 60% more energy efficient than their peers who had less diverse boards. So in your handout, you'll also find a couple more studies if you'd like to dive a bit deeper into this aspect of gender diversity and environment. And we'll also share in the chat a publication that came out from the IFC on gender responsive climate governance and the role of women leaders. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Fiona.
Great, thanks so much for that, Landon. So that gives us a good overview there at the case for gender equality. And I think we've hopefully highlighted that even if you already thought that it was a good idea to take action on gender equality, there's lots of reasons for businesses why it's particularly an important topic to focus on as well. So we'll narrow in a little bit more now and look at the state of the market. So in this section, we're going to hone in on some of the key terms that we're using when we're talking about gender equality and look at the state of play globally. So to get us started with that, I've got another question to ask you in Menti. So I've shared the link again to Menti with you in the chat. So if you don't have that open, make sure to click that link there, but hopefully you already had that open in the background. And so the question that we have now for you is to get a sense of how long you think, based on our current trajectory and how things are progressing, how long is it going to take us to reach gender equality? So you can take a guess there at anywhere on the slider from 10 years up to 500 years in increments of 10 years. So have a think and see what you think about how long it's going to take us to reach gender equality at our current rate of progress. And then we'll take a look at the right answer together. Okay, so I see lots of guesses coming in so far. Most people may be guessing between maybe 10 and 150 years, and then a few people kind of going 200, 300, 400. So I'll give everyone another second or two to let us know what you think before we show you the answer and discuss that a little bit more. Okay, so it looks like the most popular answers are probably maybe around 100 years and around 50 years, but most of you thinking maybe, yeah, somewhere either under 50 years or somewhere around the 100 to 150 year mark. So let's see. There we go. So we should be able to see the right answer now. So indeed, it's 285 years is the answer that we have found from data. So unfortunately, still a very long time before we're going to see gender equality on the current trajectory. And this statistic comes from a report by UN Women, which we will share with you in the chat, which shows that it will be almost 300 years before we reach gender equality. And I'll note that this measurement might differ depending on how we measure gender equality. So, for example, the World Economic Forum also does some studies on this called the Global Gender Gap Report, and they say maybe slightly more optimistically that it could take 130 years to achieve gender equality based on their calculations. So a little bit faster, but overall, of course, still a long time. And everything indicates at this point that we're not going to see the equality of people based on gender achieved in our lifetime. So really shows us, I think, that there's a lot of work to do. So that's just an interesting thing, I think, to start with understanding. And so now let's dive in and look a little bit deeper about maybe what this might look like, particularly within companies. So the first question for you here is to have a little bit of a think and take a guess at what percentage of CEOs of listed companies do you think are women? And the answer we're going to be using to show you here is just for Africa as a continent. So of course, that's going to vary a lot, I appreciate, based on different markets, but we'll show you a bit more data for different countries. But unfortunately, because we didn't have Ethiopia in our data set, we can't ask you specifically the answer for Ethiopia, but we can show you what some of the neighboring countries or perhaps close countries to you might be looking at the moment. And maybe it'll be interesting to see whether you think that would be the same or higher or lower for Ethiopia. But the question to start with here is for Africa as a whole. And so you might be familiar with kind of some studies that have been done on this topic of how many female CEOs we have. So there was an American study that went viral that indicated that there were fewer large companies in the US that were run by women than by men specifically named John. So clearly an indicator that there's much progress needed in corporate America as well. And another aspect was that among chief executives of S&P 500 companies, for every female CEO, there were 4 men named John, Robert, William, or James. But that's for the US. And so what do you think this could be in Africa? So I'm seeing predominantly maybe around the 10% mark, it looks like is maybe the most popular answer that people have given us here. Someone's been kind of gone down the 50% mark, but most people, I think, guessing between maybe 0 and 20 overall. So let's show the answer now and we'll show you the data and studies that this information comes from as well. But in Africa, as an average from the studies of the markets we've looked at, 8% is the average percentage of CEOs that are female. So quite low, but we're going to show you soon how that compares to other regions as well, so you can get a sense. And then our second question, just to see, maybe have a think about whether you think this would be higher or lower than CEOs, is the same question, but for the percentage of board seats. So how many or what percentage of board seats do you think would be held by women in African markets at the moment? Give everyone a moment or two to have a think. I see some of you sharing your answers in the chat as well. So a few people have mentioned quite low numbers, maybe only 5 or 3%, 10%. So I don't know which number you guessed for the CEO mark, but maybe people thinking it could be lower. So mostly guessed between 0 and 10% by the looks of it. So let's have a little look. So actually the answer is 21% for board seats held by women. So a bit higher than for CEOs. So to some extent that's a positive thing, but of course a long way off 50%. So still lots of room for improvement, but a little bit higher than for CEOs. And so we'll dig into this data a little bit more in a moment, but great to get a sense from everyone here of what you think and maybe. And as someone said, actually, that is bigger than expected in some regards. So it's good to have some positive news there. But let's take a look now at maybe a deep dive into how that compares to other regions and some of the different markets that we've studied this for. So I'll pass back over to Landon, who's going to take us through some of that data. Thanks, Landon.
Great, thanks. And yeah, excited to go through some of this data. So For those who haven't seen these publications before on your screen now, the SSE, in collaboration with the IFC and UN Women and some other partners, have worked together to provide markets with an overview or a benchmark of current progress on gender in leadership of listed companies. And we'll dive a bit deeper into some of these reports to see how you all did on the last Menti question. So first, this is last year's report covering the G20 as well as regional groupings. On your screen now, you can see the first section covering the G20. We'll also share a link to this publication in the chat so that you can read it in your own time, and all these reports can also be found on the SSE publications page. This data can really serve as a benchmark for exchanges and other institutions in their effort to promote women's full and effective participation in and equal opportunities for corporate leadership positions. With that, the first table we see here on the screen shows that the average percent of boardroom seats held by women in the G20 is about 23%. You also see a lot year over year positive changes in the second column with all those green figures. And then the top 5 exchanges are located in France, the UK, Italy, Australia, Canada, and then the US. It's also worth noting, given that France leads the leaderboard for the G20, that France has a regulatory requirement for women on boards, requiring 40% of board seats to be women. However, even though the percent of women on boards is among the highest in the world, France's female executive leadership pipeline is not as strong. And for that reason, in May 2021, the French Parliament voted to introduce gender quotas for executive leadership with 30% minimum for either gender by 2027 and 40% by 2030. But you can already see they've clearly exceeded that 2030 target of 40% already. We also see a lot of countries improving slightly each year, but there's also an issue within the G20 with a lot of markets having all male boards. For example, in 11 markets in the G20, more than 20% of the top 100 issuers have male-only boards, which is a problem for a lot of the reasons we discussed earlier with the benefits and drawbacks of not having gender diversity in leadership on companies. Now, let's take a bit more of a regional approach to the data in corporate leadership, and we see that only 2 regions have on average over 30%. That's Europe and US CanZ. For awareness, US CanZ is a bit of a unique grouping. That's Australia, USA, Canada, and New Zealand. But it's significant to note that only 2 regions have over 30% because it's been highly researched that at least 30% representation is required for a fair power distribution and for the less represented group to be heard. We see Europe leading with 37%, which, as mentioned, is obviously very much bolstered by France with 44%, and then US CanZ at 34%. And then you could say third place, there's Africa. This included South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Morocco, and Egypt. But there's also a big variance, I would note. For example, South Africa, JSE or Johannesburg Exchange has 32% women in board seats. Well, we include Egypt, and Egypt has just 12%. So even though this region is at 24%, there's a big difference. And then we see Eastern Asia in 5th place, followed by Latin America, and then a big drop off for Western Asia, where we see just 8% board seats held by women. So we'll continue in a bit more on the data. Okay. 1 second. This slide is always a bit slow to load. But on this next slide, we'll look at our last research for Africa. So this is the five largest African markets. So unfortunately, we do not have Ethiopia on here, but you can have a think as we go through this market, how your market might compare to these. So again, we see South Africa leading, followed by Kenya, Nigeria, Morocco, and then Egypt, with a much smaller amount, about half of South Africa. With that, let's discuss a bit more what you might think are, oh, sorry, we do have some additional data, but this is from 2023. So this one, we also include Rwanda, Nigeria, Ghana, Botswana, and Zimbabwe. I'll note here that we also see a fair amount of firms with all male boards. So South Africa only has 1% firms with all male boards, but you see as high as 15% in Kenya with all male boards. And then the average is actually about 17%, which is far too high, obviously. We have a few more exchanges in Africa, and then here you see the firms with all male boards being quite high among this cohort too, with as high as 34% or about 1/3 all male boards in Tunisia. So with that, I want to discuss a bit more. What do you think might prevent a company in your region or your market or beyond from advancing on these particular metrics? So if you could type in the chat, what do you think might be the barriers preventing progress to see more women in leadership positions? So I'll give you a moment or two to type out some answers in the chat. I see someone right off the bat said culture. Absolutely. Culture is a huge element. Data. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Opportunity and perception. Lack of access to education. Absolutely. Yeah, a lot of people saying education. So that ties in with training and professional development opportunities, particularly in areas with frontline operational or financial responsibilities that can hinder women's attainment of qualifications. I see lack of awareness, absolutely. So lack of awareness or skepticism about the business case for gender balanced leadership can mean that initiatives to advance women may not be a top strategic priority for companies. And as allies, men in leadership who have embraced the values of diversity and inclusion can help to elevate the importance of such initiatives and drive action and improve that lack of awareness. I see someone else noting lack of mentorship and sponsorship. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great answer. So lack of access to role models, mentors, coaches, and sponsors can stunt women's leadership potential. These individuals can play important roles in boosting women's self-confidence, guiding their professional journeys, and championing their advancement. What else do we see? Perception and culture. Absolutely. I'd note kind of tied into role models, mentors, and coaches. We also have limited access to networks and connections, which can make board and management qualified women less visible to nominating committees and to prominent men who could advocate as allies and champions. I see work-life balance challenges and caregiving. That's a really great answer. Yeah, double work burdens at home and the workplace. Absolutely. So oh yeah, I see data coming up a lot. So there can be limited availability of sex disaggregated data and inconsistent reporting practices, which makes it difficult to measure progress or understand the extent of the gender gap. In turn, that can create a challenge in identifying effective interventions to close the gap. I notice one that has come up a lot is biases and stereotypes that can suggest women don't have the characteristics needed to lead, such as logical thinking and decisiveness, or creating a double bind in which women are expected to be nice or competent, but they can't be both. Those biases are more subtle than the norms that deliberately exclude women, and they can actually be a bit more challenging to overcome. So those are all great answers. I'll quickly take us through a couple that I don't think we've answered or gone through yet. So the first one I'll mention is lack of gender-sensitive human capital management, including hiring, retention, and promotion processes, such as having non-diverse hiring committees and limited use of gender-blind applications. That can lead to decisions based on biases rather than on qualifications. Failure to recruit widely for applicants or not embedding a gender lens into job postings can also reduce the number of women qualified applicants. Excuse me. Then I do think this one came up through the chat, but there can be unsuitable work environments in traditionally male-dominated industries, which can make it difficult for a woman to pursue long-term career paths. For example, there may not be women's locker rooms for changing out of uniforms or women's washrooms with privacy for managing menstruation or anything else. And while not specific to women in leadership, such lack of accommodation represents an overall deterrent to women entering the sector and progressing through the leadership ranks. I don't think this one was mentioned in the chat, but maybe I missed it. But there can also be safety concerns, especially in operational locations and gender-based violence and harassment, which can represent serious deterrents to women's professional advancement. Gender-based violence and harassment in the workplace and domestic and sexual violence experienced beyond the workplace can affect employees' well-being and business operations. These experiences can lead to reduced productivity, increased absenteeism, and higher employee turnover. It can also deter women from pursuing the promotions and career development opportunities that are stepping stones to senior leadership. So I think I covered kind of all of them now, or we covered all of them rather. So it's important to note that achieving a truly gender diverse senior leadership team and optimizing the true value in diversity is about more than sheer numbers and gaining parity in representation. The key is ensuring that men and women have equal voice and agency once they're in those leadership roles, so that they all can contribute to determining their organization's path. To increase the number of women leaders and prepare them to take on leadership roles, companies must truly invest in women. This means attending to the culture and purpose of their organizations, and it means adopting a more people-focused business model as part of an approach that integrates an ESG orientation into all aspects of operations. Now, climate and environment has come up a good amount so far, and if you'd like to dive deeper into this topic, I recommend also reading a recent publication from the IFC on gender responsive climate governance. This report looks at why we aren't seeing the level we'd like to see. In other words, what barriers are getting in the way. Some examples of what this report finds are a lack of knowledge or training on the topic, a low level of climate and gender lens literacy, and little understanding of the impacts on business. We'll share in the chat the link to this report, and you can also find it in the handout slides. I'll turn it back over to Fiona now.
Great, thank you for that, Landon. So brilliant. So before we go into our break, we're going to take a little bit of a look at the complexity of this topic and focus in on some of the key terms that we want to use when we're discussing gender equality. So to get us started with that, we have another opportunity in Menti to get your thoughts on this. So our question in Menti this time is around getting a sense of what gender means to you and how you currently define it. So there's no right or wrong answer here. And if you can only think of one or two words as well, that's no problem. But using this Menti slide, which you should hopefully be able to see in a second, if I just flick onto the question, there we go. Our question is to share a few words about what gender means to you and how you currently define it. So it might be that you know an official definition that you want to share here, or maybe you just want to share in your own words how you're currently thinking about it. So we'll have a little bit of a look at that together, and then we'll also look at some definitions that we can draw from our training from UN Women as well. Give everyone a moment just to have a little bit of a think about that. Okay, great. So someone's mentioned obligation, which is an interesting word, a role, an expectation as well, a social outlook of sex, women and men's role. Someone's mentioned a biological difference, about decision making. I see a few people have shared in the chat as well. So I see socially constructed and unnatural, interesting. A role of a person related to natural gender selection. Okay, so we've heard unnatural and natural in the same two comments, so that's interesting. A marginalized but productive part of society, a social construction, and then we're seeing expectations used a few times in the word cloud here. And some people mentioning that it's a qualitative thing. Maybe it's about social and cultural elements. It's a sensitive topic. Lots of interesting ideas here. Thanks everyone for sharing. I see a few people mentioning social or cultural norms or a social construction aspect to this. So that's great. So lots of different thoughts here. So I think predominantly we're seeing the words come through that it's about social aspects, cultural aspects, and those differences and how it's constructed and different roles and expectations. But I know a few of you are also sharing around sex as well, and some people mentioning the difference between men and women. So we'll go into this in a moment, but it's always a really interesting question because I think it really shows, obviously, the breadth of how we're all thinking about this topic that's very fundamental to our lives, but that there's lots of different ways that you can think about this issue. So always really interesting to see what everyone shares. So thanks for giving us your thoughts there. So I'll leave that open if anyone wants to share anything more. And now let's have a little bit of a look together at the definition that we'll use for today's training. So lots of really good answers there, but we do want to make sure that we're all on the same page and that we understand the depth of gender. And so the first thing to be really clear on is that gender is not simply about sex, about being male or female. And this purpose of this exercise here is really to make sure that everyone understands that gender and sex are two different things and that gender can differ in different contexts and societies. And so this is important because it's not really different sexes that we always need when we're speaking about the value of diversity. It's actually different ways of thinking, different lived experiences or life experiences, and different institutional restrictions and freedoms. So whilst the term gender is actually quite difficult to define, and I think you've seen that already there from the number of definitions we have from ourselves, because it really means something different to different people, let's get a bit of a better idea of what is typically included in this term. So for UN Women, we can see here the link to the gender equality glossary that you can take a look at as well to explore a few different terms. But in the UN Women glossary, gender is defined as the social attributes and opportunities that are associated with being male and female, and the relationships between women and men and between girls and boys, as well as the relationships between different women and between those of different men. And so these attributes, opportunities, and relationships are socially constructed. And that's something I saw several of you mentioned in your responses. And so these attributes are learned through socialization processes. So they're context and time specific, and they can be changeable as well. And so gender ultimately determines what's expected, allowed, and valued in a woman or man in a given context or society. And so, of course, in most societies, there are differences and inequalities between women and men in the responsibilities that they're assigned, the activities that they undertake, and maybe the access to and control over resources and their decision-making opportunities. And so gender is ultimately a part of the broader social cultural context. Another important criteria that inform that context will also include class, race, poverty or income level, ethnic group, and age. So I think the main thing that we want to say here that, of course, is that gender isn't as simple as just male or female. Gender can be influenced and defined based on the nature of relationships, on hierarchies, on history, on context, and on institutional norms. And so most importantly, when we're discussing gender equality today, please remember that we're referring to that overall sense of equality and not simply just increasing the number of women on boards, for example. And so you can find more about this and some of the different terms associated with gender equality in that glossary that you can see linked on the slide there that you can access in the slide handout. And thanks also as well, I can see several people sharing their perspective on this in the chat as well. So appreciate everyone sharing this as well. And so another key term that we talk about a lot in this space that we just wanted to unpick a little bit is diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. And so this is possibly something that you might have heard of already, and we're increasingly seeing companies focus on having a team or individual in their organization that's focused on this area of activity. And so what we want to explore here is, why do we need all of these three elements together to ultimately achieve equality? And so thinking about each of these aspects in turn, let's explore why they're important. So if we start with equity, this is all about ensuring an equitable power distribution among people. So you can think of equity as providing women and men with the same microphone that amplifies their voices to the same extent, so that everyone is speaking at the same level and can be heard equally. And so you might then be thinking, well, that's what we're aiming for, isn't it? Well, not quite. It's just one part of the picture. So let's say, for example, that our objective is equity or equal power distribution. But what if there aren't any women in the organisation to fairly distribute that power to, or no one to pick up the microphone? So that's why we also need to focus on these other elements. And so if we focus as well on diversity, diversity is about ensuring representation. So the act of inviting the underrepresented gender to join the board, for example, will enhance the diversity of the board. So you can think of diversity as being about having enough seats at the table for the different diversity of perspectives to be represented. And this is again where different perspectives and life experiences can be really important and valuable for organizations. So it's not enough to have microphones at the table to make sure everyone can speak at the same volume, but we also need to make sure that there are enough chairs so that a diverse group of participants are there and willing to speak. However, if we just have these two together, equity and diversity, we can still have what we call cultural assimilation taking place. And so, for example, this could mean that women are at the table, but they feel as though they have to act like men to get their voices heard. And in this sense, we will then struggle to keep them on the board, and we won't necessarily benefit from the diversity that we're aiming to achieve. So it's not good enough to give someone a microphone and a seat if they're not feeling willing and included and able to speak. And so this is where we also focus on having inclusion as well. And inclusion is all around the behaviors and practices that make all members of an organization feel welcomed and give them equal opportunity to connect, belong, and grow, and to ultimately contribute to the organization and feel comfortable and confident being their authentic selves. So inclusion is all about the behaviors that everyone adopts so that people feel that they can share their diverse and different perspectives. And so if we bring all of those aspects together, we can say that diversity is being invited to the boardroom, equity is then having the empowerment to speak in that meeting, and inclusion is around being listened to within that meeting. But of course, this goes much further than the boardroom, and that's just an example of how this could work, but it's something that we should be thinking about across all teams and activities within our organizations. And so when we bring these three areas together, the overall end goal here is equality. And as you can see in this diagram, equality really depends on having all of these three aspects brought together. Because if we're missing one part of this equation, we're unlikely to be able to sustainably make the change and to keep long-term progress. And so it's important when we talk about equality today and in our session on Wednesday as well, and especially when we're talking about the benefits that it brings, that we're remembering that we're not simply looking at having equal numbers of women and men, although of course that is something that we can measure to understand how we're doing. But what we really want is these three different things: diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so you can find a more detailed version of this diagram in the handout slides as well, available from the webpage. But at this point, I think it's a good opportunity to take our quick break at the middle of the session. So hopefully that'll give you a moment just to reflect, maybe have a little stretch or grab a drink. And also, if any more questions have arisen while you're thinking about this, feel free to share your questions in the Q&A as well. But what we'll do now is we'll start a 5-minute timer and play you some relaxing music. And then once we reach the end of the timer, we'll restart the session. So thanks everyone, and we'll see you in 5 minutes.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Hope you had the chance to stretch your legs or grab a cup of tea, but we'll keep moving. And now that we have the initial concepts clear, we'll dive into the content and start with how we can enhance an organization's performance on gender equality. The objective of our next unit, Align, is to ensure that your practices align with the global best practices and standards, as well as any local or peer practices that should guide your efforts. Let's begin. Oh, sorry, moved ahead too many slides. Let's begin by looking at the global principles that companies can use to enhance their practices on this topic. With that, the global standards we're going to discuss today are the UN Women Empowerment Principles, or the WEPs. And before we go into the principles, we wanted to get a sense of your current familiarity with the WEPs. So if you could let us know, is your organization already a signatory of the WEPs? So you can use the Zoom poll that should be on your screen now. So if your organization is not yet a signatory, in just a few moments, we'll give you some information about how to become one at the end of this section. For the folks that are answering that they don't know about their organization status, if they're a signatory of the UN Women's Empowerment Principles, I encourage you to check in with a colleague who might know. And if you are not a signatory, then we definitely encourage you to advocate for becoming one. So happy to see some yeses in there, but we'll stop the poll there. And with that, as mentioned and promised, we're very lucky to have with us here today an expert on the UN WEPs. And as was introduced at the beginning, Miwa is joining us from UN Women today to help provide an overview of the WEPs and to answer any of your questions about the UN WEPs. Before she gets started, however, we're going to play a quick video that introduces the WEPs.
Think about the impact of a signature. Think about the magnitude of a global movement. Think about the difference you can make and the power of transformative change. By signing the Women's Empowerment Principles, you can galvanize your shareholders and stakeholders to drive change in the workplace, marketplace, and community through a framework of 7 principles. Brought to you by UN Women and UN Global Compact, the Women's Empowerment Principles are a roadmap for business sustainability, innovation, and productivity. Businesses by the thousands and in every sector are becoming part of this world-changing movement to advance gender equality. Businesses that become models for attracting talent, entering new markets, serving their communities, and measurably improving the bottom line. Because gender equality means better business. Don't miss this moment to make a lasting impact on your employees, suppliers, customers, and investors. Join leading companies already on the journey to greater sustainability and growth. Commit to the Women's Empowerment Principles and make today your organization's signature moment.
Okay, great. Hopefully that video tells you a little bit more, but with that, and as promised, there we go. We'll turn it over to Miwa from UN WEPs now.
Thank you so much, Landon, and good morning, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be here. I'm happy to see some web signatories here, but also non-signatories. So I hope you can use this time to either refresh your memory on the WEPs principles or learn about the WEPs principle. So my name is Miwa Park, and I coordinate the WEPs at the UN Women HQ, and I'm delighted to be part of this training to go over the Women's Empowerment Principles, or WEPs in short, with you. With raising importance of ESG, many companies are realizing the importance of gender equality, yet many are unclear on how to concretely advance gender equality and women's empowerment. I saw earlier that someone wrote in the chat, in the Q&A box, that gender equality isn't essential. It's essential for economic growth and institutional performance, and was wondering how their company can practically integrate this understanding into their workplace culture. And also there was another question, I believe from the same person. How can we make gender equality a daily practice and not just a policy statement? And that's where the WEPS comes in as a guidance or tool or roadmap to help you, and let me go over those. So the WEPs provide a holistic framework for companies focusing on 5 pillars of action: leadership, governance, workplace, marketplace, community, and tracking and reporting. Companies are using the WEPs as a blueprint to position gender equality in the core business strategy, as well as through their operations and beyond. Companies join the WEPs community to make a public commitment to gender equality and women's empowerment on a global platform, and to embark on the WEPs journey across and access to tools and resources and engage with UN Women. I will go over the 7 principles of the WEPs very briefly. These principles are not organized in the sequence of importance, yet grouped by different pillars, but it makes the most logical sense. So companies are signing on to all of the 7 principles of the WEPs when joining the WEPs. The first principle is on governance leadership, strategy and gender responsive leadership. So it builds on a foundation for the WEPs work, requires the CEO's commitment and buy-in from the executive team to make gender equality a whole of organization priority. So we are not only talking about appointing more women in senior leadership role here, though that's important. Rather, CEOs and the executive committing to and leading the implementation of the WEPs by making gender equality and women's empowerment a top strategic priority. The second, third, and fourth principles focuses on the workplace pillar, from respecting human rights, adopting or amending policies to remove discriminatory, biased, and stereotypical practices, to equal pay for equal work of value, sexual harassment policies, and providing training on gender equality for all employees. Then the fifth principle focuses on the marketplace pillar. A lot of the WEPs signatories are working on the internal changes, but we are encouraging companies to go beyond. Companies can influence their marketplace by investing in women-owned businesses, or procuring from gender-responsive companies, creating gender-responsive marketing practices, and more. Then Principle 6 focuses on the role of companies in the community. We encourage initiatives and advocacy that make a real difference in women and girls' lives, and we invite companies to actively consult and engage with women and girls in local community before rolling out the initiatives. Ensuring that their voices shape and the process and that truly benefit from the outcomes. Then lastly, Principle 7 is an underpinning principle to measure results. What gets measured gets done. So companies are encouraged to regularly collect data to understand their progress over time. And we also encourage companies to report on weps.org in their sustainability report and through other channels. I went too far ahead. So this slide shows you where the WEPs signatories are based. This map illustrates that WEPs is a global agenda. We have CEOs from over 11,000 companies in all industries and communities in more than 108 countries that have made public commitment to the WEPs. And Ethiopia, I just checked this morning, have 17 signatories to the WEPs. So becoming a WEPs signatory is about going on a journey to achieve gender equality rather than a checkbox exercise. Companies need to work on engaging internal and external stakeholders and make ongoing and meaningful progress. When doing so, we encourage companies to tackle deeply rooted systematic inequalities rather than just taking the easy road with some ad hoc activities. The image in the slide shows the steps after committing to the WEPs and being accepted into the WEPs network. So after consideration and signing, let me explain what these mean. Activate. Activation is where your commitment becomes action by developing a strong action plan with clear goals and key performance indicators. Your company can turn intention into measurable progress. This step begins with honest reflection, understanding your strength, identifying areas for growth and address gaps, and through self-assessment tool, the creation of your action plan, you lay the groundwork for lasting impact on equality across your business. Then engage. Engagement is about broadening your impact. As part of the WEPS community, you have the opportunity to involve your employees, business partners, clients, and customers in building a gender inclusive ecosystem and value chain. By fostering dialogue and collaboration, you extend the reach of your commitment beyond your own company. Driving change is collective, sustainable, sustainable, and transformative. Sustaining progress means ensuring accountability by tracking results by collecting gender statistics and gender disaggregated data. By communicating your progress, sharing experiences, and reflecting on lessons learned from the activate and engage stages, your company reinforces its commitment to gender equality and women's empowerment while inspiring others to do the same. Report, transparency and accountability are key to sustaining progress on gender equality and women's empowerment. By reporting on progress and sharing both challenges and successes, your company not only demonstrates impact, but also strengthens trust among your stakeholders. As you lead by example and scale your efforts, you inspire peers across industries and geographies to take action. In doing so, your company shapes a global movement where gender equality is embedded in business practices and drive long-term transformative change. So this may sound like a very difficult process, but don't worry. At UN Women, we offer over 200 tools and resources to guide companies on how to work on the WEPs. So I'll go over the tools in the later part of the slide, but right now I will focus on how can you become part of the WEPs network. So first, your company needs to be legally registered. We only accept companies that are legally registered. So we accept companies from all sectors, sizes, and ownership types. So if you're eligible, you can go to weps.org/join, then fill out and submit the application form. The form is self-explanatory, but if you are in doubt, you can find the step-by-step guidance on our website. The Web Secretariat will review each application and get back to the applicants within 10 to 15 business days. And there are a few things I'd like to emphasize before you send your application. First, the CEO signs the CEO Statement of Support. CEO, we are meaning the CEO, the person with the highest decision-making authority. So this signature date is very important also, as it marks the day when your company chooses to take a stand for gender equality. It will be visible on your company's web profile page. Going back to the CEO, having the endorsement of the top leadership, whether you call that person CEO, managing director, or chairperson, ensures that the commitment is not only symbolic, but also backed by the influence and vision needed to drive meaningful change. So we require that. Second, we invite the CEO to share a personal quote emphasizing how you will contribute concretely to gender equality. This is also an opportunity to highlight why this agenda matters to your organization and to share the actions you're taking or planning to take. Lastly, CEO photo is also important. We only accept professional headshot and no logo picture only is accepted. For more information on the WEPs, you can visit weps.org website or ask in the Q&A function, as I'll be here answering your questions throughout the session today. So that was all from my side, and I'll hand it back to, I'll come back with the examples soon. So for now, I'll hand it over to Landon. Over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Miwa, for that introduction. And we recommend all of those looking for a first step on this topic that you start working with your leadership to become signatories of the WEPs. For those that are already signatories of WEPs, which are more and more every day, we wanted to also flag what you can consider doing next This slide here highlights one of the options available, which is taking your commitment an additional step further by having your gender equality practices certified. EDGE provides a certifying service that can help you to take your practices to that additional step further, and also provides a communication tool to show the market that you're a leading company on gender equality. In the next session, we'll have a member of the EDGE team joining us as a guest speaker, so we'll hear a bit more about this then. And for now, I'll turn it back over to Fiona.
Thanks, Landon and Miwa, for that. Fantastic. So that's really shown us a little bit of what's happening at the global scale with WEPs as a particular initiative that can really support organisations to take forward this topic. But we're going to have a little bit of a look now at what should be considered based on your location as well. And so one of the key factors that should be considered based on where your company is listed, as well as where your main operations are, is regulation. So let's discuss what we're seeing here from a regulatory perspective. So on this slide, we can see a number of markets where there is some kind of gender quota or requirement set for listed companies. This is from a past report that the SSE produced. And on the right, you can see the current status of gender diversity on the board of companies in these markets, as well as the percentage of female board chairs and CEOs. And so one question we often get asked is whether or not quotas or mandatory requirements work, and if this should be implemented in a country. And so this is a hotly debated topic, and if you'd like to have a dig into this in a little bit of more detail, you can review some extra slides we've included in the handout presentation here, which provides some insights from a study conducted by the UN Principles for Responsible Investment about gender-based quota policies and what they found on this. But as we've seen in the data that we've already discussed today, there's quite a range in the number of women on boards, of female CEOs, etc., across different markets. And it's not necessarily always clear that there's a relationship between whether there's a mandatory compliance requirement and what the actual performance of the market is. And so why is that? Well, it's not entirely the reason, but a part of this is because it really depends on how individual companies within a market implement these quotas and mandatory requirements. And so what actions are taken by the company and how such a rule or regulation is then interpreted within organizations. So to explore this in a bit more detail, we're going to come down to the company level and see what we mean by this about how a company implements it with a little bit of a hypothetical exercise of two companies. And so we're going to be using two different companies for our exercise today. We'll call one Peacock PLC and the other Owl Inc. So as you probably guessed, these are fictional companies, but the discussion that we'll have is based on their decision-making processes, and it does draw from research on real companies as well and what works. And so in our case study today, we're going to say that both of these companies currently only have 10% women on their boards and in executive leadership positions, but actually that both have around a 50-50 parity between the genders in lower level operational positions. So it's already clear that women aren't getting into the higher level positions. And they also have another thing in common in that they both just had a change in leadership and have had new CEOs join. And let's say that both CEOs are expecting a new regulation to come in, and so they're preparing for a mandatory minimum rule relating to gender equality, requiring them to increase their female leadership. And the new CEOs at both companies are passionate about gender equality and they want to achieve equality at the top of their companies. And they also are keen to be included in a gender equality index as well, which will give them exposure to new investors that value gender parity. However, this is where the similarities stop, and we see that the two companies take quite different approaches towards these goals, and we'll explore a little bit how we think that could then play out. So if we start with Peacock PLC, as I've already said, they have a new CEO, and what they decide to do is to set a bold target of having 40% women in leadership positions in 2 years' time. So going from 10 to 40 in 2 years, obviously a big change. And to help reach this 40%, the CEO decides to make an announcement to staff, and as she's a woman, she shares her experience of climbing the ladder and uses this as an example to encourage other women to follow her to the top as well. And they also set a hiring freeze of any men until the target is reached, unless that's specifically approved by her as the CEO for some sort of extenuating circumstances. So some quite bold actions taken here, obviously, to achieve this target with, an intention behind driving rapid change. But what we might see from this is we might see that some employees are perhaps feeling excited and empowered about this change, but overall there could be some negative feelings as well. So firstly, there may be some women who are now feeling a lot of pressure, and they might feel as though they have to move up the organization or move out and don't like that feeling. And also, of course, for men in the organization, there may well be job security and career advancement concerns. So overall, the sentiment and reaction to these actions is likely to be a mix of excitement and fear. And so let's look then at the approach that their competitor Owl Inc. takes. So as I've said, Owl Inc. also has a new CEO, and what they decide to do, instead of setting a kind of a target and having that hiring freeze, instead they decide to join an organization called the 30% Club. And if you're not familiar with this, the 30% Club calls on its members to commit to trying to achieve 30% female representation as a minimum on their boards and executive leadership. And the reason that 30% is seen as a significant objective is that this is the critical mass at which minority voices become heard. So overall, although they want to surpass this 30% club objective in the long run, they decide that that's a good aim to start with to support their activities. And also what they realize is that they want to increase female leadership, but they're not actually sure of the root causes of what's stopping women from progressing in the organization. And so what the CEO decides to do is to set up an internal task force to find out what the root causes are that might be preventing women from climbing up the ladder. And at the same time, the CEO also initiates a reverse mentoring program. And so this is a real opportunity for women in those operational roles to share with leadership their experiences and help the leadership to understand and learn from them as to why maybe they're not progressing in the organization. So this has two benefits, both by enabling leaders to hear more diverse perspectives from those working at an operational level, and also for interested staff who participate in the mentoring program to potentially progress their careers and get more exposure to leadership as well. Okay, so we've heard there of a few different possible strategies that companies could take from those two examples. And what we'll now do in Menti is have a little bit of a look together at which of those strategies you think might be the most effective. So thanks, Landon, for resharing the Menti link there. And I'll just share my screen as well so I can move the question on for you. So what you now need to do is take a look at those 6 different types of action that we've heard about and rank them in order of which you think would be the most effective at the top to the least effective in terms of achieving that goal of gender equality. So ranking your top choice as the one you think is most effective. So I'll give everyone a moment just to have a think about that. But as a reminder, those activities that we talked about there were to set a target of 40% women, to share examples of role models at the top, to initiate a hiring freeze on men or the overrepresented gender, to join an organisation such as the 30% Club, to create a gender equality task force, or to have a reverse mentoring programme. So I'll give you all a moment to have a little think about that and we'll see how you rank those different activities. I see also that whilst we've been talking, a few people have shared their perspectives here. So Derege mentions that having a target or quota for women in leadership is not yet a culture in Ethiopia. So thanks for sharing that. But someone also mentions, Zinabi, that the Ethiopian higher education institution does have a target. So interesting to see that practice is maybe happening in some areas, but not in others. Okay, thanks everyone who's completed the rankings. I'll just give you a moment and see if anything changes again, but I think the rankings maybe are getting more consistent. So that's interesting. So overall, it looks like the top ranked activity is setting that target of 40% women in leadership. So that's an interesting one, in fact, because obviously we've seen those two ideas here, either having the 40% target or joining an initiative such as the 30% club. And so actually, interestingly, we find that maybe there could be some challenges with having that target. So although 40% is a higher percentage, obviously, than 30, and suggests that this is an ambition, what it actually does is it almost sets a ceiling and suggests that this is the highest level that's going to be expected. But what the 30% club aims to do instead is recognize that there's a minimum level needed for minority voices to be heard. And so what they are really doing there is trying to get that top circle of the diversity, equality, and inclusion image, which was inclusion, to be achieved. But what the 30% club does is aims to push further beyond that as well and uses that as a starting point. So just in our opinion, we think possibly that could be more effective, but maybe there's a role for both as well. And a lot of people have highlighted as well the creating a task force as a key activity. Indeed, we often see that as a good place to start because unless you really know the root causes of the problems here, of course, you may not take the right sorts of actions. And then I see as well that the examples and role models has come out as a popular one too. And indeed, this is an important activity. So I think it's interesting, the two activities at 3 and 4 here about having the examples and the reverse mentoring program. And so whilst both can be valuable, I think one is obviously sharing role models from the top is a one-way form of communication. And that's actually where sometimes there can be advantages to the reverse mentoring program, because that allows a much more open and two-way dialogue between the leadership and their workforce as well. But indeed, as most of you have ranked here, a hiring freeze is something that we would recommend exercising caution over. So although obviously it might drive some rapid change, what we can also see is that this can, potentially create some negative sentiment in the organization as well. And if you remember also when we were talking earlier in the session about equity in the DEI slide and power dynamics, what we can find here is that actually by exerting such a powerful approach as setting a hiring freeze, we can necessarily potentially lead to some negative cultural outcomes for the organization too. Okay, fantastic. Thanks for sharing, everyone. So we're going to go back now to have a look at how that might have played out, in particular for our two fictional companies that we were talking about earlier. So just wrapping this up quickly, because I think we already talked through some of these things on the slide before. So if we talk about Peacock PLC, as a reminder, they took the approach of having the hiring freeze and the target. And what we saw is that there was quite a quick change in their organization, but because they didn't get to the root causes of what was driving the lack of women in leadership in their organization, they didn't necessarily identify and address some of the barriers that they had. And also, they had some negative culture change in their organization from having a hiring freeze, which meant that they had more people leave the organization and potentially, therefore, leading to new costs for more external hiring and ultimately less innovation in the organization as well. So, although there were good intentions by the CEO, because they didn't get to the root causes, they didn't necessarily effectively address the issue. And in our second example here with Owl Inc., as I've said, they had similar ambitions and intentions to Peacock, but took a different approach. And so what's important to say here is that probably Owl Inc. might have had to invest more initially and resource more this approach. So they would have needed to invest in establishing the task force, for example, and the women mentoring and reverse mentoring program. But what that would hopefully deliver in time is that they would really start to get to the root causes of why they were having issues for gender equality. And they would be able to take specific actions about those. So what we then see is the result is that the company has a more innovative approach, and they're able to then really push their leaders to think of new and innovative approaches, learning from the experiences of their workforce who shared things through the task force and the reverse mentoring program. So overall, we think in the long run that Owl Inc.'s approach would likely be the one that would be more successful. So, regulation, of course, does depend on not only having a quota, but also, as we've seen there, really setting in place the right culture and understanding the deeper issues that are at play. So, we don't necessarily have enough time to talk about this in detail now, but we will come back to this later. But I'll just share with you this slide here that gives you a useful list of actions that you could take to make sure that you identify those root causes and don't make those same mistakes that Peacock PLC did. Okay, and then I think I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to skip past that poll if that's okay, to allow us to have enough time for our speakers. So beyond that local perspective now, we're going to then look into focusing on the level of companies and looking at some of the peer practices that you could adopt to stay ahead. And so I'll be reintroducing Miwa here, who's going to help share some examples of what we could do.
Thank you, Fiona. So let me go over to my slide. Great. So I kept the examples for this part particularly so you'll learn from what Web Signatories has been doing to make the gender equality and women's empowerment into tangible actions. So let me first share some examples of implementing the Web Spy Web Signatories in the workplace. I have a example from a leading bank in Sweden where they tackled the gender pay gap across its 16,000 employees in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Sweden. And I believe there had been a question regarding gender pay gap, so maybe you want to focus on this part. So to ensure their fairness, the bank introduced a job evaluation system that is regularly updated and compared roles across the organization. So this approach allowed them to measure and monitor pay equity effectively, and the bank's initiative is backed by close monitoring and regular reporting, which has strengthened transparency and accountability. So again, start with measurement first, and then try to really understand how much are you paying men and women and others so that you can really compare and close that gap. The next example is the one that gives a lessons learned to always consult with your stakeholders and keep cultural context into account. So there was a textile manufacturer in Pakistan who invested a large amount of money to provide an on-site childcare facility for their workers to use, as majority of the factory workers were women with young children requiring childcare. Yet, they found out that no one was using the facility. The company then consulted their employees and found out that standard norm in the community was for children to stay home with their grandparents who were the main caretakers. The company then changed its approach and instead offered childcare subsidies, which was welcomed by the employees much more than the childcare facility. Moving on to the marketplace, a financial platform in the US had a goal to boost the amount of leading women entrepreneurs, especially from small businesses, providing them with great economic resilience and independence. So they created a specific fund that looks into improving the flow of capital to women-owned businesses and lower their cost of capital. Then second example is a group of companies that are from the global watch and jewelry sector, from brand to supplier, across over 18 countries, and participated in a gender responsive procurement pilot led by UN Women. So as the first industry-wide effort to embed gender equality into supply chain, the pilot mapped key gaps in procurement, and by moving from company-level pledges to collective action, the initiative sets a precedent for how whole industry can transform global supply chain to advance gender equality and women's empowerment. The companies are currently pursuing the second phase of the pilot, where we are co-creating supplier questionnaire, codes of conduct, and more. So the Web Secretariat offers over 200 tools that can help you with your own web's journey, and we have various case studies, templates, and thematic guides, and learning modules, and more that help you to be one step closer to your gender equality goal. And here are some of the key webs tool. The first tool we recommend you to take is the Gender Action Plan module. It's a roadmap for the process of developing a gender equality and women's empowerment action plan. In combination with the gender gap analysis tool, it helps the company embed gender equality into its strategy and operations. We provide a gender action plan template for those interested in creating one. The next one is Gender Responsive Recruitment Checklist. It has been developed to guide companies to practice gender responsive recruitment. It can be used for your in-house HR department, of course, as well as for outsourced recruiting firms and headhunters to guide your company towards more inclusive recruitment. This is only available for web signatories. The next one is Gender Responsive Procurement Assessment Tool, which helps companies to advance gender equality in their marketplace by helping them assess if their procurement policies and practices are gender responsive. We encourage web signatories to use this tool themselves and to invite their suppliers to do the same, thereby amplifying the impact across the whole business ecosystem. All these tools are available for free at webs.org. So now I will hand it over back to Fiona.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Miwa, for highlighting those resources and those good examples, I think, of a source of inspiration here. Excellent. So coming towards the end of the session, I'm very pleased to introduce our guest speaker who's joining us today from Bloomberg. So we've obviously heard here about lots of data that companies could collect and ways to dig into and understand this topic. But it's interesting to see as well how the financial community are starting to use this information in the form of gender indices. So we're pleased to be joined by Eureka Murasawa, who is a sustainable finance data senior specialist at Bloomberg. So thanks for joining us, Eureka, and I'll pass over to you.
Thank you, Fiona. Give me 1 second to share my screen. One moment. Okay. Hopefully you're able to see my slides.
Yes, all good.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Eureka, and I look over the Bloomberg Gender Equality Scores from the APAC region at Bloomberg. So today I will walk you through to briefly introduce the gender equality scores, how Bloomberg scores gender, and conclude with a short training exercise to show how data can challenge initial perceptions. So let me start by giving a brief background of the gender equality scores, or GE scores for short. GE scores is a globally standardized reporting method designed to acquire workplace gender data. Each metric within the GE score is clearly defined to ensure consistency and comparability across different markets and industries. The metrics used to assess gender equality have been carefully selected through a combination of research and internal review. And most importantly, the gender-related data is scraped from companies' public filings, and corporates are strongly encouraged to disclose this information to promote transparency. So diving into the GE scores taxonomy, it's broken down into 3 main issues: leadership, talent pipeline, equal pay, and inclusive culture. These are further split into sub-issues, which are constructed of similar types of data fields. And moving on, this is the scoring structure. So the scoring framework is structured hierarchically, where the scores are built of individual fields, and which are then grouped into sub-issues, which are further aggregated into broader issues to give you the overall gender equality score. And each component is evaluated on a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 representing the highest level of performance. I'd like to now introduce a few offerings Bloomberg provides to companies, especially to ones that do not have access to our Bloomberg terminal. To ensure corporates can learn, view, and challenge the Bloomberg ESG scores and associated data points we capture, Bloomberg has launched the ESG corporate web portal. Any company under our Bloomberg scoring universe can make an institutional account for free at the link on the right bottom here. And upon logging in, corporates can gain a better understanding of the Bloomberg ESG score, review what ESG data has been collected from companies' public filings, challenge any data points by submitting the correct value with the public report, which will be reviewed by our Bloomberg data team. Currently, this portal only supports our Bloomberg ESG scores, although we are considering to onboard the GE scores to the portal soon. In the meantime, corporates can request for a gender equality scores materiality framework. So the materiality quality framework will have granular information on the GE scores and all the input data we have captured by fiscal year. To receive this document, please request from the email address you see below. Upon receiving this document, companies can review their score and challenge any input data point via the email address as mentioned here. So now I'd like to shift gears and go over a simple case study together to give you a better idea of what all of this means and investigate how data can challenge initial perceptions. So here we have two companies that we'll analyze, Louis Vuitton, a high luxury fashion brand, and Nike, a popular sportswear brand. Firstly, think about the company's high-level social factors at play and any biases you may have. For example, which company may be more advanced on their gender equality journey, which may have more policies or initiatives to promote equality in the workplace. So now let's dive deeper with the Bloomberg data, looking beyond the perceptions to see how data can drive your decision making. So looking here, we have company A and B score. At first glance, we see company B has a higher G score. Looking further into the issue level, we see company B has a much higher leadership score, largely because of the executive section, while the board level is fairly similar. The executive portion is where company B really stands out. Some interesting underlying data is listed at the bottom as well, where it's evident company A has slightly more women on board and committees chaired, however, falls off on executives. But company B is a bit more constant throughout all three and does better on the consistency element. Now looking at the talent pipeline issue, we can see from the underlying data points at the bottom, company B is at parity, whereas company A is above parity. However, if we look at the talent pipeline score, company B is again a little bit higher. This is mostly due to company A being flagged for not disclosing data values, like here, whereas company B is transparent for all data points. Lastly, for the equal pay and inclusive culture issue, or the benefits available in that company, again, for the overall score, we see company B is doing slightly better than company A. For this issue, most of these data points are binary, meaning yes or no, where 10 means they have a policy in place and 0 means they don't. For example, for the anti-harassment training, backup family care, are areas we see the biggest difference, but both do not disclose parental leave data, which would be a big impact in this area as well. So it was fairly quick, but I'd like to now take a quick poll to see if you can answer which you think company A, which had a lower GE score, is, if it was either 1 for Louis Vuitton or 2 for Nike. We'll give it a few seconds. Okay. Thank you all for voting. It seems quite tied, a little bit on the Nike side, but around 50-50. Very interesting results. The actual answer was A for Louis Vuitton with the lower G score, and B Nike with the higher GE score. But the overall purpose of this brief exercise is to hopefully challenge some of your initial perceptions and to give insight on what data investors are looking at to make decisions. Even if a company is performing well in one area, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are completely well advanced in gender inclusivity specifically. So I'd like to conclude with a powerful quote. You can't manage what you don't measure. Highlighting the importance of more data transparency can help analyze and make improvements in the company's gender equality space by being face-to-face with the data. Hopefully you found that interesting, and if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Eureka, and for bringing that to life with us with that really clear example as well. As you say, it's always interesting to see how the poll goes as to which company people think is which, and a very close result today. Great. So I don't think we have any specific questions, but a big thank you again for joining us and for sharing that content. So just to wrap up our session today, I'm going to cover off a few things now to close us out and just set us up for our session on Wednesday as well for our part 2. So a final mentee question for you is really just to reflect on what we've covered in today's training and to think about if there are any key takeaways that you have so far, or maybe any activities that we've discussed in particular that you would like to explore taking forward in your organization. So that would be great if you could please share with us your answers to that question. Oh, Menti's usually blue and now it's white. That's strange, but we won't mind that. I can still see your answers. So we see a few of you mentioning maybe looking at training, discussing this with your colleagues, maybe thinking about setting a gender policy, having some discussions, looking at your gender equality scoring, indeed, thinking about joining the WEPs, thinking about your alignment to global standards. Fantastic. Thank you, everyone, for sharing. Lots of good takeaways there. So as we say, lots to think about on this topic, and there isn't going to be any single activity necessarily alone that can solve this issue, but many different strategies to think about in parallel. So I know that can sometimes feel overwhelming, but I hope that some of the resources and the checklists and tools that we've shared throughout today, and which you'll be able to find in the handout materials as well, can help you to get started or to take more steps as well if you already have done. Fantastic. Thanks everyone for sharing those thoughts. And then a final mentee question just to wrap up our session is to get a sense from you all on how you feel about those objectives that we started with at the beginning of today's session, and how you feel comfortable now, hopefully a little bit more comfortable on those topics than when we began. So thus far, I see whoever's responded has flagged that they're feeling very confident, and a few responses coming through now. So that's great to see. And I'll leave that open for you in the background so that you can vote on that still. So please do let us know what you think. But I'll just go back to PowerPoint just to share a few final slides with you as we're finishing up the session. So firstly, just to mention, we know that there's a lot to cover in this training and it's a big commitment in your week. So we're very appreciative of that and your interaction in the training. As a reminder, it's necessary to take part in the 2 parts of the training program to receive your completion certificate. But if you'll join us on Wednesday as well, then you're able to get your certificate for participation in the training. And we'll share the instructions on Wednesday about how to get your certificate. As we close out, I'd just like to say, firstly, here are the contact details for the different organizations who are participating in the training program. So you're very welcome to reach out to any of these email addresses if you have any more questions or anything you'd like to follow up on. And if you look at our web page, we shared a number of times in the chat, you'll find all of the slides there, which also includes the slides from our guest speakers, and that includes information on how to reach out to those organizations as well. But all that really remains is for me to say a big thank you in particular to Eureka for joining us as our guest speaker today, and to Miwa as our partner at UN Women for co-facilitating this training with us today. So thanks as well to the SSE official supporters, who are a group of stock exchanges and organizations really supporting our work. And finally, a thank you in particular to the partners for our training, IFC, Colombia, UN Women, and the government of Luxembourg as well. And of course, last but very much not least, we'd like to thank the team at the Ethiopian Securities Exchange and Financial Sector Deepening Ethiopia for hosting us and bringing us all together today in the training program. And lastly, of course, a big thank you to all of you who've joined us for the session today. We hope this has been useful, and feel free to have a little think of any questions you might have for us before our session on Wednesday, and we'll look forward to continuing the training with you then. So wishing you all a good rest of your day, and we'll look forward to catching up again later in the week. Thanks, everyone.